Welcome back to The Explainer. So, you know that irresistible urge to reach out and touch a wall the exact second you see a wet paint sign? Today, we're unraveling a truly fascinating psychological puzzle. We're looking at why some people instantly, almost desperately, resist rules. We're going to explore exactly what's happening in the human mind when a simple instruction feels like an absolute restriction. It tells us so much about the core of human nature, so let's get right into it. Have you ever noticed someone who doesn't just break a rule but gets visibly uncomfortable the exact moment a rule is placed on them? Like, they might have been perfectly happy doing the exact thing the rule demands, but the second it becomes an enforced rule, nope, they immediately want to do the opposite. Now, on the outside, this just looks like pure stubbornness. But if we pivot our empathy for a second and look a little closer, what is actually happening deep inside their cognition? Okay, let's dive into our psychological roadmap. We're going to cover the illusion of defiance, why we hate rules, the hidden need for control, processing a complex world, and finally, how we're wired for autonomy. Starting off with Section 1, the illusion of defiance, and looking beyond stubbornness. We really need to reframe rule-breaking here. It isn't just mere disobedience or a bad attitude, it's actually a deeply ingrained psychological adaptation. And the absolutely crucial point here is this concept of identity threat. For certain individuals, rules simply don't feel like helpful guidance. Instead, they feel like an intense, suffocating form of control. And to them, being controlled feels like losing a core piece of who they actually are. Their entire identity is built around being an independent thinker. So following an imposed instruction, it doesn't feel like just being a good citizen. It actually feels like their individuality is being completely erased, turning them into just another faceless person in the crowd. Which brings us to Section 2, why we hate rules and the internal drive behind it. There is a very real, fundamental psychological divide in how human beings process structure and authority. And this brilliantly illustrates that divide. On one side, we've got people who are externally controlled. They rely pretty comfortably on outside systems, rules, and expectations to navigate their day-to-day. But on the other side, we have the internally driven. These folks are guided strictly by their own personal standards and choices. The really important thing to grasp here is that internally driven rule resistors don't actually hate structure. What they specifically reject is imposed structure. If they choose the system, they'll follow it to the letter. But if you force it on them, they reject it entirely. It's exactly why they will fiercely refuse to read an IKEA manual, even if it takes them twice as long to build the darn bookshelf. So how do these internally driven minds actually view rules? Well, they see them as massive oversimplifications that completely lack nuance. They literally spot the exceptions and flaws in rigid systems immediately. And while some people look at rules and see safety and protection, this group associates them directly with limitation and confinement. Even a tiny instruction removes their individual choice, and that causes real psychological discomfort. Plus, they naturally have a high tolerance for uncertainty, meaning they just don't need those clear boundaries to function. For them, breaking a rule is quite literally a mechanism to restore their own sense of control. Let's move into Section 3, the hidden need for control. This is the iceberg beneath the surface. The fascinating thing here is that this exact same need for autonomy doesn't just stop at breaking rules. It spills over into incredibly common, seemingly unrelated everyday behaviors. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how this underlying psychology elegantly explains totally different surface actions. Take someone who refuses to get tattoos, for example. They often do this to preserve a fluid identity. They're resisting a permanent loss of flexibility or control over their physical self. Or what about the person who instinctively tries to fix everything in a crisis? They find comfort in control, automatically turning chaos back into manageable order. And the individual who absolutely refuses to ask for help, that's a defense mechanism. They're protecting their inner strength because relying on others feels like an unpredictable loss of control and an uncomfortable exposure to vulnerability. It all maps right back to the exact same need, preserving identity and control. And this underlying drive even extends to what happens inside our heads when we're totally alone. Think about the classic overthinker profile. We almost always view it as simple anxiety, right? But psychologically speaking, overthinking is really just the mind's attempt to regain control over a situation that has already ended. By constantly replaying conversations or agonizing over what people meant, or even fearing the changes that future success might bring, the brain is simply trying to maintain its tight grip on a complex reality. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, processing a complex world. Let's look at how these highly autonomous, internally driven, and often very observant minds actually process the massive amount of information around them to maintain that control. It works like an incredibly sophisticated loop. First, there's input, basically gathering information by silently observing. Then comes context building. Instead of just reacting instantly, they mentally map out the full situation. Next is feedback, where they deeply evaluate mistakes and results. And finally, adaptive behavior, adjusting their future actions based on the patterns they just learned. And what's absolutely mind-blowing about this is that advanced AI systems are currently being modeled exactly after this process. Highly adaptive AI, much like a highly observant human mind, learns to predict outcomes not by blindly following static rules, but by deeply processing experience. When we contrast these two modes side by side, traditional thinking is pretty simple. Data comes in and immediate reaction goes out. But adaptive thinking models the environment and builds rich context before taking any action. This perfectly explains the quiet observer personality profile. You know those people who speak very little but seem to notice literally everything? They aren't just reacting or speaking to fill awkward silences. Instead, they're actively protecting their inner world while intensely building context. That way, when they finally do make a move, it's highly informed. This gives them an incredible advantage, the power of pattern recognition. For these adaptive thinkers, silence isn't an absence of thought at all. It actively allows for deep observation. In fact, while strict rules tend to slow them down, pressure and complex chaos actually sharpen their minds. They can easily connect separate, seemingly random signals into one cohesive pattern. Both advanced AI and these highly observant people thrive under complexity. They don't just react blindly to surface-level data or rules. They extract the true meaning from the noise. Ultimately, this all comes down to Section 5, Wired for Autonomy, and valuing the choice itself. Let's synthesize everything we've learned about why personal freedom outranks just about everything else for these individuals. Let's move to this chart and see how this builds. When it comes to motivation, the breakdown is radically different. For most people in the world, the outcome is the most important thing. But for these autonomous minds, a massive 80% of what drives them is the process and the choice itself. The final outcome only accounts for about 20%. So for rule breakers, how they do it matters vastly more than what they actually achieve. And that leads us directly to this really powerful realization. They would literally rather fail on their own terms than succeed by blindly following someone else's rules. This is profound. When we see someone self-sabotaging or overthinking their own success, it's very often not because they fear failure. Actually, scratch that. It's more like they fear that if they succeed by conforming to external expectations, they'll lose their true, independent self in the process. But when someone fully embraces this internal drive, you start seeing clear signs of them reclaiming their autonomy. They move from the chaos of constant rebellion into true peace. They build intrinsic self-worth rather than constantly seeking approval. They naturally outgrow the endless, predictable noise of social media. They begin valuing their own privacy way more than public attention, and they fiercely protect their mental energy from the sheer exhaustion of constant comparison. Embracing autonomy really means dropping the need for external validation altogether and empowering your mind to focus entirely on real lived experiences instead of curated digital expectations. You don't just see behavior, you understand the mind behind it. When you realize that resisting rules, staying quiet, or refusing to ask for help isn't just someone being difficult or stubborn, well, everything changes. You realize it's a fascinating, deeply complex survival pattern designed to preserve a person's core sense of self and control in a highly unpredictable world. So the next time you encounter someone who absolutely refuses to follow a simple rule, ask yourself, what are they really trying to protect? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope it completely transforms how you view the incredible autonomous minds around you. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next one.